Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
I hope everyone had a great weekend. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Nightlight. If you like the live shows or listening in the archives, please subscribe to Barbara's YouTube channel. You can leave a comment and help us to know what you think about our programming. I think Barbara slept from midnight Friday to noon today after 5 shows last week. But you aren't going to find too many networks offering that type of variety. We have our first brother and sister guest tonight. We've had sisters. Sometime soon we are to have a husband and wife paranormal investigation team. But what makes our guests special, aside from Dan being a beekeeper and Teresa being a counter, they are direct descendants of the famous American outlaw Jesse James. When Dan Duke's first book, Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, was published last year, he was a guest with us. Since then, he enlisted the aid of his sister Teresa Duke to help research and co-author The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James. This book is a culmination of 20 years of research with family, court, legal records, newspaper clippings, journals, family legends. It's a fascinating book. So if you enjoy the Wild West, Reconstruction era history, The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James is something that should be on your bookshelf. And we are going to be separating fact and fiction tonight of this misunderstood historical figure. Hi, Teresa and Dan. How are you?
Fantastic. I hope y'all are all well, too.
I'm doing great, and thanks for having us on.
Yeah. Thanks for writing another book to keep us busy. I really enjoy. Well, I enjoy both of your books, but this one is really well done biography, and we'll be getting into a lot more of its merits over the next couple hours. So, like what I said at the beginning of the show was, we did 5 shows last week, and we got some emails over the weekend that made all the hard work worth it. One of the emails was about Hollywood wanting to revive the Brady Bunch series, and the studio wants Mary Joyce to be Marcia. Michelle Avante is to play Jan. Gloria Amendola is to be Cindy. Michael Carter can be Greg. David Collis is to play Peter. And keeping everything running smoothly, Barbara can be Alice. Dan, you can...
You do know I'm listening and I'm sitting right here, right? I mean, yeah.
Well, Alice had an important function, and Dan can play Sam. He's a nice-looking guy. Take you out in town.
I strongly recommend you do not quit your day job.
Okay, let me get back to before I get into more trouble. Okay, so,
good idea.
Anyhow, okay, so I don't know, maybe Rob Sullivan and Solaris could be Mike and Carol. But anyhow, the studio wanted to start off the series with reworking the Jesse James episode. So, Teresa, if you were to take the place of the older guy who presented the Hollywood propaganda version of Jesse, and you were to explain to Bobby, played by me, how would you explain who the real Jesse was to the impressionable and sweet Bobby?
Oh wow, that's a great question.
That's where I'm close to losing my job again.
I would probably start off by telling Bobby that, I saw that episode, believe it or not, when they were bashing Jesse James on the show. And I wouldn't go that approach. I would just kind of explain to him about the war that was going on, the Civil War, and how Jesse was being true to his beliefs and his family, and being honorable and defending his family. I would, being that Bobby is a little kid, but it would be very hard to explain. But I would just come out and say he was doing an honorable thing by defending his family and fighting back, and that they were abused, and there's nothing wrong with defending your family and, going out and rectifying that situation.
And early on in the mysterious life and fake death of Jesse James, you do say it is confusing. Or it is, right there on like page 2. We're dealing with aliases, folklore. We never really had a good description of Jesse, other than he was about 6 feet tall.
Oh yeah,
you get the, did he or did he not have, a part of a missing finger? I mean, there's like so many things we don't even, really. He wasn't living all that long ago, and we still don't know a lot about him. As we go through the show tonight, I think we're going to correct some misconceptions, but
Exactly.
you do get the book started off with some of these folklore aspects that seem like it's more of pop culture, but once you introduce the photos and more evidence, things become a lot more clearer.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And we could start with some of the information from the traditional view of Jesse James presented from the Jesse James Museum and Farm in Missouri. What is the traditional story they present? Dan, you want to take that one?
Well, the traditional story of Jesse, well, it starts early in his life. He was a young teen, around the age of 14. The fighting, like most people think of the Civil War, that's when the fighting started. When the war was declared, first shots fired, that's when it all started. But what a lot of people don't realize is in Missouri and Kansas, the war had been fought. They'd been fighting back and forth for about 10 years before the official beginning of the Civil War. And Jesse was young. He was 14 by the time the war started. So there was already a lot of bad blood between people in Kansas and western Missouri that were raiding one another for 10 years prior to that. Frank, when the war started, Jesse's older brother Frank was off fighting for the regular Confederacy. And some guerrillas rode on to the farm, northern backed guerrillas from Kansas, rode on to the James farm. Jesse was plowing the field, 14 years old. They strapped him to the plow and brutally beat him. Then they rode on to the house and pushed his pregnant mother around. Some accounts claim that they stripped her shirt off, tied her to a tree, and whipped her severely. But either way, she got roughed up. Then they took his stepfather, Dr. Reuben Samuels, and hung him, trying to get information out of him as to Frank's whereabouts, and he wouldn't tell. So they kept hanging him, and he had permanent brain damage as a result of that. And Jesse, being a 14-year-old boy, the times back then were completely different. It was a rough life, rough way of living. I'm sure that was the frontier, and characters in the frontier were usually, they had to be tough and used to rough ways. So Jesse wanted revenge, which is understandable even in these days. He wanted payback, but nobody would take him. He was too young to fight. So he found a group who would take him, and that was Quantrell's guerrillas. If you were of fighting age, in their opinion, then if you could hold the pistol and shoot, that was good. So Jesse got involved with the guerrillas. He was very good at what he did, and over the course of the Civil War, he got a lot of revenge. At the end of the Civil War, he rode into Lexington, Missouri to surrender, and some of the Union soldiers who were picketed outside of Lexington shot him through the chest. So he got a bullet through his lung. Somehow he rode off, he escaped and lived, and that was the beginning of his story. Basically, all normal Confederate soldiers were granted amnesty, but if you were a Confederate guerrilla, especially with Quantrell's gang, you were hunted down and executed. If they caught you, they'd kill you. So he had a choice, either leave the country or stay and fight, and he chose to stay and fight. And that's when his outlaw career began.
Yeah, well, Dan, the summary you just gave us of, mid-teen years, explains or amplifies what Teresa said about Jesse was fighting to protect his family. I'm just trying to differentiate between looking for social justice or something like that versus just being a sociopath type criminal. There's just a totally different mindset from someone like Hannibal Lecter.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yes, they had. I was just trying to make a distinction. Oh yeah.
And well, during their guerrilla years, during the Civil War, people claim, some authors claim they were bloodthirsty killers, but the fighting was it was bloodthirsty on both sides. Like his mother was pregnant the day it all started, and they pushed her around and roughed her up. And Quantrill's guerrillas were known. They didn't touch children or women, but if a man was of fighting age, which meant 13 up, they had no problem. They would kill him.
Yeah, there was a lot. It was very intense, the political and social tensions during that time, and on both sides, it was so intense that it boiled over into just very terrible atrocities happening to both sides of people's family, and he witnessed a lot, and so he just he was going to take it on himself to sign up with the guerrillas. And
well, another example of that, the fighting along the border, the Kansas-Missouri border, seemed less political than more of a revenge type fighting. It was two different sides. One side started, the other side had to pay them back. They all wanted revenge, and it got worse and worse throughout the war. Like the Younger brothers, for example. There was Jesse and Frank James after the war. It was the James Younger gang. Their surname was Younger, Cole Younger and his brothers. They supported the Union before the war started. And their dad, who was a Union supporter, staunch Union supporter, was riding into town to do some business, and some Union soldiers robbed and murdered him. And that's what politics went out the window there, especially with the Younger brothers, and they decided to fight with the Confederate guerrillas just as a means of getting revenge on the men who murdered their dad.
Yep. And roughed up their mom. And
yeah. Oh yeah, and they also burned their the Youngers themselves. Their mother was at home, and Union guerrillas burned their home down around them. They lived, but they had a few seconds to get out of the house, and they torched everything they owned. So, and they were Union supporters, but they were, it was a rough, confusing, strange place to be.
Yeah.
And neither side, if I was explaining it to a child, I would try to tell them, the best thing would have been for them to have left.
Yeah.
In the long run, looking at it, hindsight's always 20/20.
Right.
Neither side had angels. Neither was an angel. Jesse wasn't an angel by any means, but he wasn't a bloodthirsty psychopath either.
Yeah. In times, the way I look at it, in times of turmoil, and those were definitely times of great distress and turmoil, you're going to have all kinds of groups, resistance groups popping up all over. And, that was their form of resistance to the unjust atrocities that were happening. They were rising up, and they were going to, defend their families.
And we're going to, in a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit more about, the bullet and some other little bits of information from the diary that you reproduced in the new book. So, and we'll get into that. So, early on in the new book, you list a number of the bank robberies. A couple pages of the bank robberies, 2-3 pages, starting in 1867. So it's right after the Civil War ended, a couple years, and they would go on for 9 years. Is that right? About a 9-year bank robbing and train robbing spree. So, what are some of the characteristics of the James gang?
Oh, I would say that they were fearless. They showed no fear. Bold and daring. Some would even say charismatic. I think the main thing was just they didn't show any fear, and they just went in there and did what they, had to do.
Yeah, and again, it was closer to 15 years. It was about a 14-year career of robbings from the first listed till the last. But they, like Teresa mentioned, he was charismatic. A lot of it was said that women on the trains, they wouldn't rob the women, but women would ask for their autographs. It was almost like not quite a rock star, but it was like he was a celebrity. People wanted his autograph.
Yeah, and to some, and depending on your perspective, to some he was famous, and to others he was infamous.
Yeah.
Some thought of him as a hero. So yeah, when you build up a legend like that, I feel like you're going to have all kinds of truths and untruths attached to you. So with a legend, when you build up that kind of
reputation,
there's going to be a lot of truths in there and a lot of untruths about,
He was considered, a lot of people, he was bold, he was fearless.
Yeah.
Along with the men, and not just Jesse, everybody who rode with him. They were
yeah.
bold, fearless. They'd just gone through a civil war, and they were very good at what they did, which was killing their enemies. Then they turned to robbing, and that was, compared to the war, I'm sure robbing was fairly easy for them.
Oh, yeah.
And, they had no other choice because they were outlawed to begin with. So they lived up to that outlaw brand. But they, there was something I was going to add to that, and I can't remember what it was now. It'll come to me later. But their hero status was greatly bolstered by their friend John Newman Edwards, who was a reporter, and he would write long columns just praising the James gang and damning everybody who was out to get them. And when the Pinkerton Detective Agency got involved and they bombed his family's home, killing his stepbrother, or his half-brother, not stepbrother, killing his half-brother, and who was at the time 9 years old, and it blew his mother's arm off and wounded his stepfather's hand, that really bolstered their image nationwide.
Yeah, John Newman Edwards really did seem to be he was instrumental in building up that legendary status of Jesse James and the other guerrillas. But it did seem like Jesse, for some reason, it was Jesse who stood out. They would talk about the other daring feats of the guerrillas, but it was Jesse James who stood out.
You do include the example after the first robbery where George Wymore was he the little boy who was accidentally killed, and there's supposedly this letter that Jesse wrote apologizing that that wasn't the intent. The young son wasn't supposed to be. No one was supposed to be killed, and he, whether or not this letter is, was really written, or if it was written by Jesse. There's something there that adds like a mystique. They aren't really trying to hurt people. They want the money. The casualties weren't supposed to happen. There's like some regret there. But it goes back to what Teresa was saying. Was it's kind of like these dashing guys are showing up on the train, like the ladies want his autograph. Hey, I was robbed by Jesse James. He didn't take anything, but I got his autograph. Yeah, it's like people wanting to marry Charles Manson.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wymore was 17, I believe.
Yeah, he was 17.
He was, which would place him a little younger than most of the gang members at that time, but very near their same age. So, they wouldn't have looked at it, in my opinion, as if they were shooting a kid. It was somebody their own age, and that makes a world of difference, especially when you're that age. But they supposedly kept telling him move, in the way I picture it. And it's not a good thing. There's no way to justify that. But they kept telling him get out of the street, and he froze, probably in fear. And one of the gang members shot him.
Yeah, it was like a stray bullet.
No, they shot him to move him out of. Well, it varies account.
Yeah.
Sometimes they say it was stray. Others say he was. They shot him.
Yeah.
But either way, the guy died, and it was regrettable.
Right.
Jesse writing the letter shows remorse. I'm sure that doesn't really help, his family members, George Wymore's family members. But at the same time, this was shortly after the war. That mindset was still with them, and I'm sure they had remorse, but at the same time, they'd just gone through years of killing countless numbers of people, and it was probably, I'm sure they were fairly cold-hearted towards a lot of what they did. If you imagine, say, a special forces group, and they've got a target, anything that stands in their way is going to be moved somehow, and that's how, trying to see it through their eyes, that's the best I can come up with. There's no excuses for it, and it was bad. He was remorseful, but, we visited that museum in Liberty, and the Bank Museum, and we asked to see a copy of the letter, and they wouldn't show us a copy because they claimed the guy who owns the bank today is deeply affected by George or Mr. Wymore's death. I didn't understand that so many years later, but at the same, maybe he is. But we weren't able to see the letter.
Okay, well, it's an interest. It just adds more to the mystique.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, and let's see, you have quite a few other, bank robberies listed across like pages, like 10 to 14 or so, but it seems like they were doing maybe a couple each year. That they seem like they were, far distances apart, and later on in the book, you two write that the gang was the James gang was extremely cautious and calculated. So, they're going to, from places like Texas into Minnesota.
Yeah.
So it's just the get there is a lengthy trip. They have to be scouting out when the bank's open, the customers, who's making like maybe the richest looking people making deposits on what day. It seems like they really had this bank robbing down to a science.
They did.
Yeah, they said that they were basically the first ones to actually invent. They were so bold and daring, and they were actually the first ones to come in, according to sources, on horseback in broad daylight and go in and rob them and leave. And they were always, hooting and hollering and shouting, and after they were exiting the bank robbery. But they said that each year, they just got more daring with their robberies, and a lot of them are. Sources said that they were the ones who invented the bank robbery, and trains too. The trains too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to touch on that. So might as well do that now. They went from bank robbing to the train robberies. Were the trains in the station? Do you know much about how they pulled off the train robberies? That sounds like it would have been that would have taken a lot of time to see what was going on, how they knew which train was which one was carrying something of value.
That's another thing. We have always suspected that they had inside information. In many cases, they would rob. They would stop a train. Other times they were on the train, and they would rob it while it was going. But they would get off at a predetermined location. That way they had people on the ground also with horses, so they could make a quick getaway. But there were a lot of their robberies. They are said to have. If you just studying their robberies, it seemed as if they had to have had inside information. They always had a decent take. Sometimes it was a great take, what they got away with. But it seems, and we've also heard rumors from other researchers claiming that, like if they hit a gold shipment on a train, the guy shipping the gold had it insured. And some have claimed that the shipper of the gold from, say, California was insured and would tip somebody off. So in that way, the gold would be robbed, the insurance would pay the owner of the gold, and in a way it was doubling their money if they were all in the same group. I'm not sure how true that is, but it doesn't, I don't count things like that out. There's just no proof about that yet. So it makes sense, hit the gold shipment, the guy who tipped them off he doesn't lose anything. He's got insurance to cover it. So they're doubling their money. That way they've got cash and gold.
Okay.
There's a lot of theories about that, and that's where it gets kind of murky on their exact tactics. And they were very secretive. They when they hit a target, it was well scouted out. And it just seems like it would have taken a few more people in higher places to have tipped them off on some of the robberies they did.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that. It's really interesting. Like crime scene investigation. You aren't going to get that. today's TV shows, but it is interesting how successful they were pulling that off in the 1870s.
Exactly. There's another example of those types of connections that I know of, and it's a fact. Well, parts of it are still a mystery, but the Ocobock bank robbery they did in Corydon, Iowa. They were in Corydon, Iowa. If you read the events in the town around before the robbery, there was a lot of people were pushing to have a railroad come through town, which would increase business and help their prosperity. Everybody in town wanted the railroad through except for a few people, and those few were the ones who controlled most of the money, the Ocobock brothers who owned the Ocobock Bank. So they didn't want the railroad, and they weren't gonna donate to have it, to the fund. So Henry Clay Dean, who was a politician, and he was a well-known, they called him the Copperhead. He was a Copperhead, they were Southern sympathizers in the North during the war. He even carried a walking stick with a little brass copperhead on top of it. He was known as a fiery orator, and when he gave speeches, he would draw people from 50 miles away. And back in those days, 50 miles was a long, long way to go. So in the day of the robbery, Henry Clay Dean, who supported the railroad, was in town giving a fiery speech, but he was on the other side of town from the bank. So most of the town went there. Everybody in the area went to the other side of town, leaving just a few people around the bank. And Jesse and the gang rode in, robbed the bank. It was real easy. And they're said to have they rode past the speech given by Henry Clay Dean and interrupted shortly to let everybody know the bank was robbed. The crowd looked at them like, "Be quiet, you're interrupting the speech, and quit playing jokes." And Jesse and the gang laughed and rode away. They got it. Nope. The townspeople didn't realize until minutes later, and by then the gang was gone. But I always wondered, knowing that Henry Clay Dean was a well-known Southern sympathizer during the Civil War and still held those political beliefs, you can't help but wonder if he wasn't involved. He served as a great distraction, and if he wasn't involved, that was great planning on their side, the gang side, just knowing that the town would be on the opposite end of, the town's people would be on the opposite end of the town during the robbery.
Hey Dan?
Yes.
Was it the James gang that robbed the train and blew the safe up with dynamite and blew all the money up too?
I think that was Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a funny story. But after the Corydon, Iowa robbery, they all fled to towards Nebraska, and shortly after that, Jesse, our great-great-grandfather, entered Texas and purchased the diary that we have. He started making entries, and he purchased it in Decatur, Texas.
Okay, and I noticed on page 14 that the last time one of your family members came to West Virginia, they robbed a local bank. So when I've seen Teresa's photos, and she, just wonder, okay, is she protecting herself from the virus, or is she going to do a hold up? So I can't take you guys anywhere.
I know. It's terrible.
But there's like, a few weeks, Susan Messina was her, and we're talking about Hank Williams supposedly died en route from after some concert, going to another place, and he supposedly died in the back seat of that Cadillac, and that was near Huntington. So that little piece of information I thought was interesting. It's kind of a local connection, but Yeah, that was like September 5th, 1875. But that just shows the extent of how far that they were going to these banks in Iowa and Minnesota.
And you had mentioned that earlier, the multiple robberies in different locations near the same time. And some people claim, and some still do, that it was copycat robberies, which some could have been. But the robberies were always in the same way. It was the same MO that the James gang used. And I mean, these guys had gone through the war. They were professionals. They were basically robbing banks was like hitting a target during the war. And knowing they had that mindset, all the guerrillas during the war, they wouldn't attack one target at the same time unless it was, in their minds a special target, and they needed everybody. But in a lot of cases, they would hit multiple targets at once. It kept people off guard. Nobody knew where they were going to hit or when. And when they did, they would hit several targets at the same time. And I think they employed that same method in the robberies years later. Wood Height, who was Jesse's first cousin and is said to have borne a strong resemblance to Jesse, he would hit certain towns at the same time Jesse and the others were hitting another town. So, that would, in my opinion, explain the multiple robberies in distant locations on the same day.
Okay. Interesting. This is just really a fascinating story. You also cover the Shady Villa Inn has a safe that was robbed by Jesse James and Pancho Villa.
Yeah, in Salado, Texas. We went and visited that, and they still have the safe is there. It's an interesting old safe, and they still tell the same story to this day. Jesse was said to have robbed it, and that was only, I believe, 8 or about around 10 miles from where Jesse lived in Texas. So, nobody had a good description of Jesse, an accurate description, except for his family and fellow gang members. So it wouldn't have been a hard thing for him to pull off and just get away. Oh, and they also robbed a stage south of Austin, a stagecoach between San Antonio and Austin.
Okay, and we're going to get into the riverboat robbery in a little bit. All this is just really fascinating about the planning that went into all of this. But note that the Northfield bank robbery in Minnesota was the last documented robbery of the James gang.
Yeah, the original gang. They to this day they have a festival in Northfield, Minnesota, the end of the James gang, and they claim Jesse was there. We don't believe Jesse was there. We believe it was Wood Height in Northfield, Minnesota. That was it wasn't. That one went wrong in every way that could possibly go wrong for the gang. The townspeople were ready. They expected it, which they hadn't run up against before. All the men who expected it, they just got out of the Civil War. They fought for the North, and they were ready and waiting. So the gang rides in, tried to rob the bank. The younger brothers got shot up. They all made it out of town, except for, I believe, Clell Miller died in town. But the James Younger gang got out of town, but the younger brothers were so shot up, they didn't make it. They got caught, ended up in prison, and it said, according to the traditional story, that Jesse and Frank got away. We don't believe it was Jesse. We believe it was Wood Height and Frank that got away. And Jesse was here, according to his diary, our great-great-grandfather's diary. He was here in Texas. But the interesting thing, so we thought, okay, if Jesse was here in Texas, how could he have been up there? And, that just warranted more and more research as much as we could find. Jesse was here. We know the traditional history says that Jesse was in Northfield. We believe it was Wood Height. They bore a strong resemblance. It is documented, though, that Frank went from Northfield, Minnesota, with a bullet in his knee, great pain, and rode a train. He went from horse to train. He finally caught a train and made it to Waco, Texas. If you had a bullet in your knee in Minnesota, back in those days when travel was long, hard, and slow, why would you wait that long and go all the way across the country? I mean, he could have gone to Colorado, or he could have gone east into Kentucky, or any number of places. But he came to Waco, and they claim that Jesse and Frank came to Waco. We know Frank came to Waco, had the bullet removed by a doctor, and then it said they retreated to their ranch that they had in Texas. Well, they claimed the ranch was out in West Texas. It wasn't in West Texas. It was 30 miles south of Waco in Blevins, Texas, on their farm, on Jesse's farm. Just real interesting story, and people around Waco were always trying to locate the doctor that did the surgery on Frank and removed the bullet, but that news can't be found anywhere.
Okay, since we're wrapping up what you said about a 14-year crime spree. You document that. I just say this: the Blue Cut train robbery netted about $15,000. I guess you have lots of other figures. Chicago and Alton Railroad train robbery was estimated to be about $30,000 to $50,000. That's probably in the 1870s. That's some staggering sums of money. That's what I don't know, $500,000 today. Yeah,
it's a lot of money, and I'd have to get, and I've done it before. I just don't remember the conversion, the difference, the interest calculators you can find on a search engine, and I would type in the amount as early as I could. Sometimes they only go to like 1890, but yeah, you can get a rough estimate of how much it would be in today's dollars, and it was very large amounts.
Yeah. So okay, Jesse is you have to do something with it. I'm sure you can't, even though there really wasn't IRS, you can't deposit that in a bank. That's going to draw too much attention. You have to do something with that, large sums of money. So in your first book, Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, you do talk about, seems like he had some in and under his house.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Buried at other places. To find all the mason jars and things like that. He had a system of locating where he deposited the loot. Dan, can you go back to your first book and tell us a little bit about the uniform distances and measurements, how and what all that means?
Okay. And before I mention that, I just typed in an inflation calculator online. $15,000 in 1880 would be, according to the inflation calculator, worth $377,000 today. So that's a very big take. It's enough to buy a really nice home, so in most parts of the country. So I just wanted to, while you mentioned the 15,000, I wanted to see how much that was worth today. So
that's 350,000 today.
$377,042 in today's money.
Wow. Okay, so this happened, multiple times. Okay, he's splitting it with the other members of the gangs. They have to do something with it. So that was what your first book was about. So
that tied in with the treasure side of it. We'd always heard the treasure stories. He had a lot of treasure, gold and silver and coins buried in mason jars. There's a mysterious one a lot of the family members were trying to find that was alleged to have been encased in a concrete ball and buried, and they allege it. Some relatives said they never found it. Others said they did, but they wouldn't say who or where. So it was, there's a lot of, and I'm sure the ones who claim they did were probably they didn't want that showing up on their bank statements or tax records. I have a feeling a lot of that came from trying to hide the tax. They wouldn't want the government taking it. There's an Antiquities Act in the U.S. that states that I believe it's any buried treasures found that are over 100 years old fall under the Antiquities Act. So, I know I've read stories of treasure hunters finding things, and every once in a while you hear that, them finding sunken ships off the coast, and the government takes it, and the finder usually gets a small percent. So, but we started hunting down the treasure legends. There was a map that had passed down through the family, and we, over the years when I had extra time, I would get into that, trying to figure it out. And it was very hard. There was this template that they supposedly used that was attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the Knights of the Golden Circle were, for those who don't know, they were a secretive organization that sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. During the war, their goal was to halt or slow Union movements, troop movements, burning bridges, things like that. After the war, it's claimed that they hid treasures all over the U.S., Canada, and Mexico for the goal of refunding a second Civil War at some point in history. When I started researching all the treasures that were attributed to them, like some had claimed that Victoria Peak in New Mexico, which was a very large treasure said to have been discovered. It was even mentioned in the Watergate hearings back in, with Nixon. The treasures that were said to have been there predate by centuries any involvement of the Knights of the Golden Circle. So and after several other treasures attributed to it had been connected with Jesse and the groups he was involved with, it, in my opinion, it counts out any involvement of the Knights of the Golden Circle. If they had any involvement, I think it was much smaller than most people believe. They were kind of made into they were a shadowy figure. There's not much known about them. And it was basically, if there's a treasure, a lot of people believed that it had to have been the KGC. So, but I discounted that in my mind and in my, just all the research I'd done. Most of the treasures that had been located had predated them. So I counted those guys out. I know that when Jesse came to Texas, he was living under an alias as a peaceable citizen. His alias was James Lafayette Courtney. The Courtneys were related to and friends with the James family in Missouri. So it was an easy name to remember and use, and so he used that name. Under that name, living as a peaceable citizen, he became a Mason, a Freemason here in Texas. I don't know if he was a member before he came to Texas or if he joined when he was in Texas. But the treasures, I believe the treasures tie in with Freemasonry, and that's where my first book came out. And I traced it from Jesse through different well-known Freemasons like Albert Pike, back to the Founding Fathers, and to Francis Bacon, his mentor John Dee, all the way back through various rabbis, Jewish rabbis, and that led me to a rabbi known as Rashi, who was the close friends and a favored court guest of Hugh de Champagne, who was the Count of Champagne, one of the founders of the Knights Templar, the original founders. So, I mean, I traced it back in that book all the way to the Templar. The template, the way it laid out, that was a mystery in itself, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself.
Oh, no, you're fine, Dan.
Okay. The template was very, very complicated to determine the scale and size of it and how it was laid out. And, I was, for years, I couldn't figure it out. It was driving me crazy, so to speak. And then I finally, the former Attorney General of the state of Texas, Wagner Carr, he was very interested in Jesse James as well. And in the beginning, he believed that another guy was Jesse by the name of J. Frank Dalton. My mother and my sister and I had, helping our mother, we debunked the claim that J. Frank Dalton was Jesse, but we do believe J. Frank Dalton was greatly involved in some part of it, the treasures. So Wagner Carr, former Attorney General of the state of Texas, believed our mother's story and our story. He had his driver show my mother and me where several large treasures were recovered. When he showed us those, in addition to another man by the name of George Roming, who was also a Freemason and a Shriner, George was hired when he was a boy by my great-great-grandfather to help him move and bury 700 bars of gold. He said they buried 680 bars, each weighing 15 pounds, and Jesse kept 20 for himself. And he drew a map out and showed us where it was buried. It happens to be on Fort Hood, the military reserve north of here, so, I'm not going to even attempt to get on that property, if it's even still there. But the locations, that was what helped me determine the size and scale of the template. And over time, I found out it was 3 templates. It all tied in with various mystic traditions like the Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and other traditions, the Christian Kabbalah, and a lot of readings I'd done that were written by Albert Pike also helped discover. The symbols were found everywhere, mostly in Masonry, Rosicrucian, studying the Rosicrucians, and Jewish mysticism. And I hope I explained that well. That's a mouthful.
The whole thing is, all of it is.
It's a captivating book.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's a very interesting story. It goes. It takes. It's almost. I had a relative ask me to explain it to him. We only had about 5 or 10 minutes, and I told them there is no way I can explain this story in 5 or 10 minutes. It just keeps going.
Yeah.
And it's got so many. Every character in the story connects to another, a different character or group, and then that just ties back all the way to the Templar.
It leads you to a lot of different, what we find fascinating about this whole journey. When my mom started this, she just wanted to prove that Jesse James didn't die in 1882, like history stated. And she thought that's all she was going to go in and prove, and it just led to so much more. I mean, there's a lot of intrigue and a lot of mystery with this whole journey that we've been on, and it does, like Danny said, it just leads down multiple rabbit holes, and it's just all been really fascinating.
One great example of how it ties in with other figures is Jesse's diary, our great-great-grandfather's diary, for example. He mentions a trip that he and the men with him took to Louisiana. They went to Shreveport, Louisiana, hopped a steamboat by the name of Amelia LaBarge. They They rode the steamboat downriver to Natchitoches, Louisiana, got off the steamboat, hit a road, and rode back north the opposite direction they just traveled, on a road. They stayed overnight at a man's house, and the man's name was Gervais Fontenot. Well, I thought, okay, who's this Gervais Fontenot? You know, that's an interesting name. You don't hear that often in Central Texas. I know it's common in Louisiana, but I wanted to research him, and I found the guy's family tree, doing his genealogy. He was the nephew of Jean Lafitte, the famous pirate. And I thought, I mean, that was mind-blowing. I thought, my God, there's Jesse James and the James gang on a robbing spree, and everywhere they went in along that trip that he documents in his diary, there were robberies. Even not the same steamboat, but another steamboat had been robbed shortly around the same time. So while they were in Louisiana, every place they went, there was a stage robbed and a steamboat robbery, and there was another stage in North Louisiana robbed. And then to find out that Jesse stayed the night at Jean Lafitte's nephew's house, that just ties it in with a lot of other interesting tidbits of history, and it shows, in my opinion, a much larger connection than just Old West outlaws, you know, robbing a bank to go have some fun at a saloon somewhere. It was much more organized and had deeper goals behind it. And Lafitte, for example, Jean Lafitte, a lot of people think, oh, he was just a famous pirate. He helped the U.S. defeat the British in New Orleans, and before that happened, he was, and this is a historical fact, he had Masonic communications with Andrew Jackson, which suggests to me that Jean Lafitte himself was a Freemason. I mean, how could you have a Masonic communication if both parties weren't Masons?
Good point.
That ties back into the treasure story in the book I'd written.
Well, and you also say Gervais Fontenot was also a retired U.S. Marshal.
Exactly. He was Lafitte's nephew, and he was a retired U.S. Marshal.
So, that could be a little bit of a stretch, but it's things like that where, you can get a retired marshal to maybe
but that's
slyly work,
that's
get the insider information.
Yeah, and if you look back at like the Texas Rangers in those days, a lot of the Texas Rangers hopped both sides. They rode both sides of the fence. Sometimes they were rustling cattle or doing other criminal activity, and other times they would wear the badge and go out and catch the same people who had done the same things they had done. Back in those days, a lot of the Texas Rangers in the beginning and through up until the late 1800s were known to have been, many of them, not all of them, but many of them had criminal backgrounds themselves. And the other point in all of that is they'd just come through a civil war. And that's where allegiances start getting, you get into a lot of gray areas there. Gervais Fontenot was a Southerner. Many of the people in his family fought for the South. He was, I believe, too old at the time to have fought in the war, but their allegiances were, I guess, put to the test is a good way to say it. I mean, are you a U.S. Marshal or are you a fellow Southerner? Are you a U.S. Marshal or a Freemason? I don't have any records claiming that Gervais was a Freemason, but I know he was involved in some way, and his story requires much further investigation, in my opinion, because I think there's a good story there. I'm just not sure where it will lead.
Oh, it's the diary is interesting, and your first book has all these maps and drawing artwork, and one of the like the central structure that amplifies your Masonic theme is the Bruton Parish Church. Can you explain a little bit about the significance of this church that, like most of the founding fathers attended at least one service there?
Yeah, when I was researching the scale and dimensions of the template, I came across other information that led to the second template, which is in the shape of the tree of life, and it falls in the original template makes a form of a veil, actually 3 veils, because there's 3 sizes, large, medium, and small, and it ties in perfectly with Kabbalistic beliefs and Christian, Jewish, and even occult Kabbalah. They have 3 veils of negative existence, which ties in with the tree of life. Everything that I'd studied involving the first template I discovered was, it tied in with the Jewish mysticism, Rosicrucianism, Freemason, stuff like that. But I wanted to find out the distance between Victoria Peak and the Bruton Parish Church, because I'd read a book from Marie, and I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, Marie Bauer Hall, who was the wife of Manly Palmer Hall. He was a well-known 33rd degree Freemason and author and lecturer. His books are fascinating, by the way. But Marie Bauer Hall's book, she wrote this before she married Manly Palmer Hall. She had been researching, and it's a fascinating book as well. It's Foundations Unearthed is the name of the book. She researched Francis Bacon. She'd found what she believed were encryptions and ciphers in many of the writings of Shakespeare. And those same ciphers, she would find similar ciphers in the cemetery at the Bruton Parish Church. She discovered through decrypting those ciphers that there was an original church foundation. The church today wasn't sitting on its, at the original foundation. It was near it, but not on the foundation. A lot of historians didn't believe her, and she proved them wrong. She excavated and exposed the original foundations that proved that the ciphers and all of everything she'd been researching was correct. She went further to state that there was a vault 22 feet below the cemetery that was said to have hidden, according to her, great treasures and information that would basically rock history if it were discovered and made public. And she started to excavate for that, and then was put to the townspeople, the people in charge, put a stop to it and didn't allow her to dig. I think she even spent a night in the jail in the town. But so they put a stop to it. Somebody didn't want her digging, and that ended. But I wanted to know how far that was from Victoria Peak. It was 1,715 miles, and over the years, I kept finding that number 1715 popping up in different areas of the research. Like the church itself is 1,715 feet from the Wren building at the College of William and Mary right down the street. Christopher Wren also ties into this story. He was a Freemason, a member of the Royal Society, and he is said to have designed that building, and that's why they named it after him. There's said to be tunnels that run under Williamsburg from the vault to different locations, homes, and possibly even the Wren building. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper. But tracing all these names back, and before I get ahead of myself, the template, I kept working with it, and it made the perfect shape of the Kabbalistic tree of life, the top of it being at the Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia, and the bottom at the recovered treasure at Victoria Peak in New Mexico. Yeah. Oh, and yeah, it just keeps going. I don't want to keep rambling on, but it keeps going. It gets deeper and deeper, and everything connects in. Everything about the template and the treasures on the Tree of Life template tie in perfectly with the veil template that I first, discovered the dimensions to.
No, yeah, and you place a lot of importance on the Victoria Peak site in the Lost Templar Treasure book. So, don't want to give everything away. A few audience members need to go out and get a copy of that one too. But
I even give the directions on how to find it. It'll take you a little work, quite a bit of work, but I give people starting points and the dimensions, the distances and measurements. So if you want to work at it, you may be able to find a lot of interesting things.
Okay. Well, hopefully soon we can have a caller call in and tell us they found it.
Yeah.
But let's bring Teresa back in here and discuss some of the photos that she rediscovered. You have a number of. A funeral photo is Jesse attending his own funeral. Some of the reversed images on the photos. We need to get into explaining how all that fits into the story that at some point Jesse died, and we have these photos that prove that he lived on according to what your research says. So, Teresa, can you tell us a little bit about some of these photos that you just rediscovered? What do they mean to the story?
Well, there's so many of the photos that match with the famous historically accepted version of Jesse James, with our family photos of what we call Grandpa Courtney. That was his alias when he faked his death and moved to Texas. We have a lot of photos. We have one where he is actually sitting. There's just so much to it. Like, he's sitting with his mother in a wedding photo. And it means a lot because, a lot of people may not know this, but history shows that his mother had her arm blown off from the Pinkerton detectives. His mother, Jesse James's mother, Zerelda. And we have a picture. We call it the eBay photo picture because that's, where it was auctioned off of on eBay when we first found out about it. But it shows our grandfather, our great-great-grandfather, in that picture with Zerelda and Frank James and his wife. And in that picture, Zerelda has her arm missing. So that's one way to distinguish. There's just so much in that picture to show. It points back that that's our grandfather. And the person who identified that was Grandpa Courtney in that picture was Jesse and Frank James's nephew. And he identified that as our great-grandfather. in the picture. So that was just one. That was like the smoking gun of pictures. It was just so much to it. And then I found a picture later on. Now, it hasn't been verified, but, you know, we do want to get it verified. But if you look at the picture, I mean, it's really, I mean, there's a lot to it. He's standing next to his mother, and it's at Jesse James's funeral. And rumors always had it that there was a mysterious pallbearer at the funeral, and a lot of people, it was rumored that it was Jesse James, and so that kind of coincides with this photo that I found.
Yeah, he looks, in our opinion, that is our great-great-grandfather. I mean, they are, and we show on the website and in the book the photos, and it's a striking similarity. I mean, there's no doubt in our mind that it's him standing next to Zerelda, and we believe the guy in the coffin is more than likely Wood Height, his first cousin.
Okay, and Dan, you've mentioned Wood Height a couple times as probably being at a couple of these bank robberies or the train robbery at this location. So can you and they look very similar since they were first cousins. Can you explain a little bit about your theory of the person in the coffin?
Okay. The traditional history claims that in 1882, April 1882, Jesse James had been living in St. Joseph, Missouri, under the alias of Thomas Howard, and that he was in the house with his wife and children. The morning that happened, Bob and Charlie Ford were said to have been there. They were allegedly working for the governor, Governor Crittenden, to try to bring in Jesse dead or alive. And most people, anybody who knew anything about Jesse back then, they felt it was impossible to bring him in alive, so they would have to kill him. And the traditional story says that Jesse stepped up on a chair, took his guns off, stepped up on a chair with a feather duster to either straighten or dust a sampler on the wall that said something like "God bless this home" or "Home sweet home," something like that. So he stood up on this chair to dust it or straighten it, and Bob Ford drew his .44 and shot Jesse in the back of the head. So that was the end of Jesse, according to traditional history. Bob and Charlie went and turned themselves in immediately and were sentenced to hang, but the governor gave them a pardon and they were released. And that's the story. Wood Height, his cousin, there's a lot of controversy on when he actually died. Wood Height was said, by some accounts, to have died in December of 1881, several months before Jesse was said to have been killed. Other people say it was just a week before Jesse was killed. So there's a lot of discrepancy on when he actually died. And when they claim that's a preposterous claim from us, our detractors will say that's preposterous. It couldn't have been Wood Height because so many people identified him. Well, first of all, very few actually knew very few could identify Jesse except his friends and family. His friends were very loyal and may have been afraid to even say anything that Jesse, that would have made Jesse mad. The family was loyal and they wanted to help their family member. So as far as identity goes, the law and no one else except for a small group of people actually knew what he looked like. And his friends and family had been known to have lied before, claiming that he was dead when he tried to fake his death in 1879. So, there's a lot of that. Their claims on that are blown out of the water. And now I'm starting to, there were several paths I could have taken on that answer.
Yeah, but we just have so many photos.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to, before I forget.
Yeah.
Wood Height there was some kind of love triangle going between Wood Height and Bob and Charlie Ford's sister, Martha Bolton. She lived in a farmhouse. She owned a farmhouse. She'd been seen she was involved romantically with Woodhite, and it said she was involved with her farmhand, Jim Gibson. There was a fight that happened. Jim Gibson and Woodhite both died in that. It was a gunfight. It's claimed that Woodhite was buried in a shallow grave, and that was that. The day that Jesse was allegedly killed, they displayed that body like a trophy, as they did with most outlaws back in those days. Woodhite's body was allegedly found and brought in, but nobody displayed it. I thought, well, why wouldn't they, when he was a big part of the James gang as well, and his first cousin? No display of his body that was allegedly found that day. We believe it was Woodhite who was shot in the back of the head by Bob Ford, and the story of the shooting itself is thrown off. Oh, and another thing real quick. To this day, nobody can identify the location of Woodhite's grave. We ask them, okay, if you're so sure Woodhite wasn't the man, where's his grave? No one can find it. We believe that's because he was passed off as Jesse. And nobody knows where the farmhand was either. If you look at like the photograph of Jesse in his coffin, what they say is Jesse in his coffin at the funeral, doesn't look quite like the photograph of Jesse's body right after he was assassinated. And we think the body of the assassinated man was either Woodhite or the farmhand, and the guy in the coffin was either Woodhite or the farmhand. So there was some body switching going on, I believe, and it wasn't hard to do back in those days. All they had to do was, switch out a coffin.
Well, and it's just, what are the odds? And when they are saying that Jesse James was assassinated, that they find his cousin, his first cousin, who looks so similar to Jesse James,
on the same day.
Yeah, I mean.
Also at the shooting itself, when Bob was said to have shot Jesse in the back of the head, it was point-blank range with a .44. The bullet allegedly didn't go through his head. Firearms experts, a lady from, I can't remember her name right now, from New Mexico, examined that and said there's no way she worked with the New Mexico State Police. It was a firearms ballistics expert. Said there's no way at point-blank range with a .44 that the bullet wouldn't have gone through his head, and he likely wouldn't have had a face.
Yeah.
Just from the size and power of a gun like that, a .44. And not only that, the room, if you've ever been in that room where he was said to have been killed, it's a museum to this day in St. Joseph, Missouri. The ceilings are so short, a man would have to be under 5 feet tall to have to stand on a chair to straighten or dust a picture. It's a very low ceiling. He wouldn't have needed a chair by any means. So, there's a lot of discrepancies on that. When right after the shooting, officials went to the James farm in Kearney, Missouri, a few miles south of St. Joseph. They got Jesse's mother, Zerelda, brought her to the house to identify the body. She walked in, looked at the body, and is quoted as saying, "Gentlemen, you have made a mistake. That is not my son." She was taken out of the room, and a few minutes later came back in, crying, putting on a show, and cursing everyone who'd killed her poor boy. I think it dawned on her that she needed to play along with it, because that was Jesse's chance at living a peaceful life in Texas. At the coroner's inquest the next day, they questioned his wife, alleged wife, Zerelda, Z. Mims, who was also the first cousin of both Wood and Jesse. They questioned her. She'd been married for years, allegedly, to Jesse, had 2 children with Jesse, yet when they questioned her, she didn't know how old he was, whether or not he was missing a finger on one of his hands, and a lot of other details about him. She just didn't know. But when they asked her about her jewelry that she had in the house at the time of the shooting, she could mention it down to fine detail, every piece she had, what engravings or monograms were on it, and every last diamond in each brooch she had. So it was kind of funny. She didn't know a thing about the guy she was allegedly married to and had children with, but she knew every detail of all the jewelry she owned. And oh, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, in the Phillips collection photo, that's the one of the man in the coffin, and
Yes.
the mourners standing next to the slightly raised coffin. There does not seem to be an exit wound in the face.
No.
Like you said, it's probably, even a mortician at that time probably would have, recommended to the family to have a closed casket.
Yeah.
This looks, like a pretty, unnerving photo, but it's not grotesque.
Exactly.
So,
And yeah, a 44 to the back of the head at point blank range would have been very grotesque.
yeah, and there's not, and like you said, there's not, the exit wound is probably going to remove most of the face. It's all there. The face looks intact. You've presented several photos, the funeral photo, as well as some of these marriage photos with Frank and Jesse's mom.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, where it's like the same woman keeps reappearing over several years of when these photos were taken, where she seems to have a shawl draped over the where the arm was
Blown off.
Yeah, blown on, dismembered.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's something more to the story with the same person showing up. It's like I just can't believe in the 1860s, 70s, 80s that there would be too many women that would be missing an arm.
Exactly.
Not only that, but we also have a picture. It's a historically accepted photo of his mother wearing a dress with a certain pattern, and we also have a photo that was in our family records of the same woman wearing the same dress, same pattern,
same missing arm, same dress, everything.
Okay, that's the one on page 34, next to the grave monument.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and
that's the one.
Yeah, and that I found a photo in our photo album of our family members. I was just looking through it one day, and I found her, and she had the same dress and the same pattern, and we had that verified and confirmed. It's the same pattern, same dress, everything, same woman.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many photos out there that match up to the historically accepted photos. It's and not with just his mom, but other family members.
Yeah, and there are so many other pieces of evidence we haven't gone over, but
yeah.
like for example, at the funeral that was supposedly Jesse's funeral, other than the photo Teresa discovered with Jesse standing there next to his mother during the funeral,
Mm-hmm.
his mother, his aunt, Jesse's aunt, came up to view the body in the coffin, and there were a lot of reporters and hundreds of people there. She came up, walked up to the casket to view the body, and said, "That's not the Jesse I know." And Jesse's mother, Zerelda, said, "That's my rabbit's foot." And I thought that would be a very odd thing, calling your dead son your Lucky Charms. That just seemed interesting. And that's no proof, but it's just one more little piece of trivia that just just bolsters our case for sure. But.
Okay, and then we can get to the well-documented 4 exhumations. They are very interesting how they don't prove Jesse did die from the gunshot wound in 1882.
Exactly.
They kind of confuse this story even more, but they don't really make any kind of case that the story ended in 1882 and the search is over.
Exactly.
So let's. Teresa, you want to start with, say the first 1902 exhumation. The body was found buried face down.
Oh yeah, which is really odd. Because
you don't have that in the photo funeral photo.
Yeah. Well, and also
you can see his face.
Yeah, he was allegedly buried at the James farm outside of Kearney, Missouri in 1882. Then in 1902, the family exhumed the grave and moved it to Kearney, Missouri, the cemetery a few miles away in Kearney, the Mount Olivet Cemetery, and reburied it, and that was 1902. And they buried the body. They said they were also afraid of souvenir hunters or somebody coming and digging him up. And I could imagine why the family would be afraid, because they didn't want somebody proving, or finding out it wasn't Jesse. But at the same time, they reburied it in 1902. In 1978, the curator of the James Farm and Museum did an amateur exhumation, or not an exhumation. He just dug up parts of the yard, found a human tooth, a dog tooth, a hog tooth, animal bones, and some different bones. He put them all in a Tupperware bowl and would pass them out to friends and people he wanted to impress, I guess. And so a lot of people had touched this tooth that they later used for testing. But that was 1978. Then 1995, they wanted to prove once and for all to the world that Jesse died as history stated. And they did, they set up this exhumation. The guy they hired to do the exhumation was James E. Starrs, a professor of law, and he had nothing to. He was not qualified as a forensics expert or a forensic anthropologist, or he didn't have the right qualifications. It would be kind of like hiring a jet pilot to fix your transmission. He might know how, but he wasn't qualified. He wasn't a professional mechanic. So, it was the same line of thought. I thought that was strange. Well,
yeah.
Go ahead.
There were a lot of discrepancies, a lot of things that cast doubt on the DNA findings that they had. It was a lot of shady, underhanded things happening. But to begin with, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, Danny, but I wanted to make the point that history stated when they buried Jesse, he was buried in a metal casket. When they exhumed the casket, it wasn't a metal one that they found, it was a wooden one. So that was one discrepancy. But yeah, sorry, Dan, you can go on. I just wanted to get that out.
And well, like the at the time, there's an attorney named Stephen Caruso. At the time, he was the Clay County commissioner, and he was in charge of, or he had possession for he was representing the James Farman Museum. He had possession of the tooth, and that was dug up in the yard in 1978, and he had what they claimed was a sample of Jesse's hair. Well, he said he didn't agree with the exhumation at all because the way it was handled, and the people they hired, instead of getting professionals, they got people who weren't even in that field to do the work and pretend to be experts, to the media, like James E. Starrs being a law professor instead of a forensics expert. But he didn't agree with it. He said it was, in his words, a tawdry sideshow. And my mother and I interviewed him in person. He told us the hair that they sampled, that they claimed was Jesse's hair, wasn't Jesse's hair. It wasn't even the hair that he had in possession. He pulled the hair out of his friend's head, John Hartman, who was the Clay County Parks director, and submitted that. He said the tooth had basically the same origins, but he didn't go into detail as to where he got the tooth he submitted. He said everything they tested had nothing to do with Jesse, and he could guarantee that. So according to the Clay County commissioner, who's today an attorney, everything they tested had nothing to do with Jesse. And the reason they got a court order to get that tooth and hair sample was because James Starrs, who claimed he got the tooth, he tries to make it look like the grave he exhumed, told the truth about the historical story or version, and they got nothing worth of value, forensic value or DNA out of that grave. But they did find, and he dug the entire grave up, making a show of it. They found a woman's partial skeleton of a woman and a man in the grave. The man in the grave was buried face down, and there were also, male and female clothes found in the grave as well. So there's really no proof as to whose grave that was and why were there multiple bodies in the grave. And then, on top of that, the guy they tested the DNA against, who was allegedly a descendant from the James line, if you do his genealogy, and we point that out in the book, his genealogy is very questionable, highly questionable. There's no proof that he is who he thinks or claims he is.
Yeah, so the DNA was basically Professor Starrs made a statement saying with 99% accuracy they can say that based off the DNA that was taken from the hair would say it was Jesse James, but we got proof that the hair wasn't even from Jesse James. So, and he based all of his findings on sources that weren't reliable. They weren't even from Jesse. They were from people, living people at the time.
And they never made public the DNA.
Yeah.
Out in public, they would claim that now it's up to you to prove that we're wrong, and we have. Mom and Teresa and I have proven them to be wrong. We have more evidence than they've ever had, and they won't put their DNA out to the public to be tested against.
Yeah, and we have, I'm not sure if you said this, Danny, but we have had some DNA testing that does link us to the James family.
That's true, definitely. There was a living descendant of Zerelda. They were testing mitochondrial DNA, which passes down the female line of a family. So we found a lady who came from a straight line of women through, from the James family down to, her day. Her name was Sue Laura Hale. She was an elderly lady. She passed away. She was living in California. Before she passed away, she went to the hospital, had her doctor take a blood sample and submit it through strict chain of custody to a doctor we use for our DNA. And this doctor does, he works for state, local, and federal law enforcement agencies and other people doing, he's highly qualified. And anyway, he tested our mother's DNA against Sue Laura Hell's DNA and said there is a definite relationship. He said to basically dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's, he wants us to get DNA samples up each generation from us to our great-great-grandfather and match that to Sue Laura Hell's or see if it matches. But he said just testing our mothers to Sue Laura Hell's, there is a definite relationship, which is more than the James Farman Museum has ever presented.
Okay, and the toxicology... Oh, Teresa, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, you do cover the toxicology report in the state. Bones and hair were tested for morphine, codeine, and cocaine. None were found. But
right. Yeah.
Later on in Jesse's diary, he does go to O'Brien's in October of 1872 for painkillers, which probably had some kind of like opium type, derived medication, which would take us back to probably morphine.
Yeah, or some form of narcotic.
Yeah. So there's the importance of what your inclusion of the diary at the end of the book kind of backs up what you're claiming, the arguments you make about the faulty test. Even though the painkiller doesn't, Jesse doesn't say exactly what painkiller. Probably at that time, there was a lot of opium being used because of all the, maiming and trauma from the recently concluded Civil War.
And even back in those days, it was common for people, you could go to a pharmacy and easily purchase cocaine for a bad headache.
Mm-hmm.
It was that which shocked me when I found that out. I thought, wow, I'd never really got into that stuff, but
yeah, and I think the main thing, we like to get out, even if people don't believe our theory, we like to get out, at least go back and read the findings that disprove that they didn't prove anything. I mean, it doesn't prove James L. Courtney was Jesse James from this, but it does prove that they didn't prove the body in Missouri was Jesse James either.
And as far as evidence goes, we're 100% convinced our story is the right story.
Oh, yeah.
And we have much more evidence than they have ever presented.
Oh, yeah.
And we've got photographic evidence, which was also verified by forensic photographic experts, whereas the guy they used to use was a water painter.
Yep.
I mean, he painted with watercolors.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That was his only qualification.
Yeah, plus the link, we have, the photos. He had a journal that had the signature J. James written in his journal.
And the thing is, when you come, I used to get mad thinking about how they would, and to this day they refuse to see evidence if it goes against their story. But the whole, this entire mess started because Jesse needed to fake his death so he could live a normal life. Mm-hmm. And so, instead of, it started with him, and I can see why he did it, but it sure left a big mystery in our official history books. So
yeah.
So it's his fault for starting that, but when you've got the evidence, it's nice when people look at it with an open mind and objectively, review the evidence.
Yep.
And then when you catch their side in all these stories, but in some cases just outright lies,
oh, yeah.
that's when it's it's sickening in many ways when you see how people act over things like that.
Yeah, with DNA, you need to use a strict chain of custody to get accurate data for the DNA testing, and they didn't use any chain of custody. They didn't follow the chain of custody guidelines.
Yeah, and like one of the forensic ladies told my mother and sister, DNA doesn't lie, people do.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. And Sunday night, you had a real lawyer, judge, talk with you, about reviewing the DNA case. How did you like having Michael Hall, who's going to be our guest next week? Just quick plug. But how did you like having a real lawyer? You're presenting information to a real lawyer. How did that affect you to listen to him weigh the case?
Well, it's as long as when lawyers or people of that mindset review something, the case, the evidence, just because they do it in a methodical way. It's a scientific method in many ways. They go over it professionally, keeping an open mind and weighing the facts. As long as a person's honest, that's the best you can do.
Yeah.
Just have it reviewed by professionals who are used to doing this. And we've talked to a lot of attorneys in the past who the questions they come up with helps any researcher who's doing research, because you realize that you have to come up with conclusive evidence.
Mhm. Which Mom did,
Yeah.
and we feel like, she was able to back up her claims because she did use.
And that's the funny thing that used to irritate Mom. It's not funny, but it used to irritate all of us. When you're trying to prove your story and your detractors and everybody else expects you to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and prove everything. You have to have a source, and everyone should be held to the same standard. The part that was frustrating for all of us was the James Farman Museum and our detractors weren't held to the same standard. They try to demand everyone else follow this strict standard and all the guidelines, which we have, yet they just talk to the media and make a claim, and it's taken as a fact.
Yeah.
Okay. And
a perfect example of that is the guy they hired to head the exhumation. He was a law professor, and he didn't. When they asked him why he didn't exhume Zerelda, because it would have been so much easier and test her, he said Missouri law stated that they couldn't do that because she didn't die under suspicious circumstances. And everybody believed it. Nobody checked out that claim. Mom checked it out. She contacted the Attorney General for the state of Missouri, and we found out that was a bold-faced lie. There was no law stating that. He just made it up and said it. And later he admitted to it, but all he said was quickly, "I embellished," and that's all he said.
Yeah.
I thought, that's just a nice way of saying you lied to everybody.
Yeah, he got busted.
Yeah.
Okay, so another interesting aspect of your book is, the journal that's reproduced covers a few years, but all of 1873 is missing. If you look on page 13 or so, where you have a number of the bank and train robberies listed, 1873 was a busy year. It was, for the James gang. What do you attribute the missing year? Did the pages fall out because the diary was so old? Is Jesse concealing something? Do you have an explanation for that?
There's the diary is in good shape. There's no page. It doesn't appear to have had any pages fallen out. There are some in later years where people have torn things out. We don't know if that was Jesse that tore a couple of pages out, or if one of his relatives, one of our relatives did, but before it got in our hands. But we're under the belief, and there's really no answer for that other than from Jesse himself, which would be impossible now. But we believe that during the really busy years, he just left things out. He was either too busy, or I don't know, maybe he didn't take the diary with him, or he was too busy at the time. I'm not sure. And if he would have taken the diary with him, in some of those cases, that may have been incriminating if he would have been, or could have blown his cover if something would have happened. Maybe he was under a lot of potential danger and didn't want to be known about his other family if something should happen to him.
Okay. And Dan, just we're coming down to like 8 minutes or so. So I just have a quick question for you. On page 1, in June of 1872, Jesse talks about the bee gum tree. Okay, you do beekeeping as well. So, do you think that's a trait that you inherited from Jesse?
I know he was a big reason. We've got photos of Jesse tending some of his hives when he was an older man, and that was one reason we got into beekeeping. My nephew got into it, and then I decided to get into it just because I love eating the honey. But yeah, the bee gum tree was an interesting thing, and I've heard theories on that, but I'm not really sure that makes that. I'm always curious about what exactly the bee gum tree was. But yeah, that's one thing that led us into beekeeping.
Interesting. So, hey, Teresa, the book comes out today or tomorrow? Finish listening to the show, then order it. But where can people get the book?
Off the Inner Traditions website. I want to say the Simon & Schuster website. Is that correct, Danny?
Yeah, you can get it at innertraditions.com.
Yeah,
Simon & Schuster, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and Books A Million.
Yeah.
Literally anywhere books are sold, you can get the book.
Okay. Teresa, is there anything, concluding words you want to say about Jesse living another 50 years after he supposedly died?
Well, this is again speculation on our behalf, but we think that maybe, he had a daughter named Ida Florence Courtney. She was born April 5th, 1882. He supposedly, they said, history states, died April 3rd, 1882. And again, this is just speculation, but we sometimes wonder, was that the reason that he faked his death so he could live out a normal life and take care of his children? And we just have a lot of questions regarding all that. But when he came to Texas, not only was he a legend as Jesse James, but we found out he was a legend as James L. Courtney under his assumed name in Texas as well. He was a very interesting, fascinating man, and I just wish I could go back in time and actually talk to him to fill in some of the holes that we haven't figured out yet. I would love to just sit down and have a talk with this man.
Cool. Dan, you want to wrap up any concluding remarks about?
Okay, yeah. Well, Teresa had said that perfectly. We thought, a lot of people, we always felt that was one of the reasons he wanted to fake his death. It was an opportunity it wasn't planned for, but it was an opportunity they took advantage of. A lot of people don't realize he tried to fake his death in 1879, several years earlier. That attempt failed because there was no body. Then when Woodhite, his first cousin, got shot, that was the perfect attempt, perfect moment, although sad for him, I'm sure, because it was his cousin and fellow gang member, but they used that, one life lost, but it helped him gain his life as a normal person, or at least keep low key over the years. Even after the fake death, for years, he was known to have done a lot of. He had been involved in burying the treasures, various treasures. He in his diary, people would come to him and exchange gold for cash. So it was almost like an underground banker in a way. He's a very interesting man, and there are so many more mysteries involved around him we would love to find, and I'm sure it'll take the rest of our life researching just to know half of the mysteries, if that much. And if people want to find the book, they can, like we'd mentioned, they can find it anywhere books are sold, online or in physical stores. It's in ebook and or paperback. Our website we've got several. The one for Jesse is jessewjames.com, and my personal website is authordanduke.com. Teresa and I are both on Twitter and Facebook.
Okay. And now that the second book is out, you are working on the concluding part of the trilogy.
Yes, sir. Working on the third one as we speak. Okay. Well, not right now, but as soon as we get off this interview, I'll be back to typing. So.
Okay. All right. So, we're probably looking at next year.
Yes. That's what my best guess is. Probably in 2021 for the third book.
Okay. All right. That sounds like a good place to wrap up the show. I just want to thank both of you for being fantastic guests. And if you like being on Nightlight, send us a gold bar.
Oh, yeah. I loved it. We appreciate that you both had us on here. And thank you.
I greatly appreciate it, and thanks. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, yeah.
You and Barbara.
Yep, both of y'all.
Yeah, she didn't fire me after that introduction, so. But I'll hear about it afterwards. But
I didn't fire you yet.
That's funny. I like that. The key word is yet.
But we can. You're welcome to come back to talk about the third book, and we didn't get to everything tonight, so we will do this again sometime soon. We will be in touch, and that's a good place to wrap up everything. So we will see everyone. I think Thursday night. Barbara, is that right? Yeah, I think it's Thursday night. Okay, so. We'll see you in a couple of days. Thank you again for everything, and have a good night.